Today we're talking about the difference between opacity and fill. You can say fill her up. You cannot say opacity her up. Hey guys, welcome to Phlearn. My name's Aaron Nays. You can find me on Twitter at AKNacer. This is Phlearn. We're dedicated to helping you get better at Photoshop, photography, and life. Today we're going to show you guys something pretty cool. It's the difference between opacity and fill. And I think a lot of people kind of get confused and don't really know what the difference is. And mainly there are two different ways that this makes a difference. There's using like a brush or a tool, and you have opacity and fill with those, and also with a layer. So I'm gonna just show you guys both, and it should answer all your questions. And I'll tell you guys kind of what I prefer and some preferred methods. So we're just gonna get into it. We got a lot to talk about today. All right, the image that I want to start off with is the Phlearn logo. I know, it's beautiful, right? It's amazing. We're gonna show you what lowering the opacity and fill looks like. Okay, so here we have opacity and here we have fill, and these are both for an individual layer. If I take this and I lower the opacity, it just makes it less visible until it goes to 0, and then you can't see it at all. We'll bring it back up to 100, and this is what we get. Now let's see what happens when we mess with a fill. Basically the same thing, because at this stage they are doing the same thing. But when they really start to get into play is when you guys are using layer effects or any kind of special blending options. So let's bring those up, and on this layer you can see just turning it off and on is just going to be visible or invisible. I'm going to click here on the layer effects, and we're going to go to drop shadow. And this puts a drop shadow. Now yesterday, if you guys don't know much about the drop shadow or have never used it, check out yesterday's episode, because we actually did use it on yesterday's episode. I'm just going to up the distance a little bit maybe, and the size a little bit. I don't know, maybe we'll bring that distance back down. There we go. We're going to keep it relatively simple for this tutorial because it's mostly on opacity and fill. So now we have a drop shadow on this. You can see this an effects here. You can turn on and off all the effects. So there's the drop shadow that we put on there. And now here's where the big difference comes into play when you're talking about opacity and fill. So as I bring the opacity down now with this layer effect, you can see it brings it down. Everything that's on the layer goes down to 0. Everything is going to be less and less visible. The difference is when you use fill, it's not going to lower the opacity of any kind of effect you put on the layer. It's just going to lower the opacity of what's on the actual layer. So as I bring fill down here, you can see what's happening. What is actually on the layer goes away, but the layer effect remains. So that's the big difference, is now basically this is a transparent layer, but because it has some information on it, the layer effect stays, which is very cool. You can use it a lot if you're thinking like, well, maybe I just have like a white camera here instead of what's going on here. I've got an image that's pretty fun. So we're going to just use the move tool, hit shift, and then click and drag from one image to another one. And let's just rescale this a little bit. There we go. So you can see now the drop shadow. It changed directions actually. I will show you guys why in just a second. But we have the logo now, and because the fill is still at 0, you can't see the camera. If I bring the fill back up to 100%, then you can see the camera again. So this is really cool. It's a cool way to like watermark images or put a cool effect on them. The reason why it changed direction with the drop shadow, let's just double click on this. Each document has its own like drop shadow, and the default is 30 degrees. So I'm gonna set this to 120, which is what the other one was on. And if you want to, you can hit make default and then hit OK. There we go. So this will be coming from the same angle that the other one was coming from as well. All right, so you can turn the effects on and off again. Here you can see what opacity does. It just lowers everything. Everything will completely go away. And lowering the fill, there we go, makes just the drop shadow now visible, and the rest of the layers are still there. So this is really cool. You can do this in a couple other things. Anything that's here in the layer effects, this is all going to show up. So let's say we wanted to do like a bevel and emboss, for instance. We could get that to be visible as well. You could just maybe lower the opacity of these just a little bit, and we'll lower the size to give it a really cool effect. And then you could even do something like a gradient overlay. If you wanted to change this to overlay, it would actually overlay what's underneath it. Or let's do soft light. There we go. And you can change the opacity of that as well. So all kinds of things you can do with the fill still being 0. You can see all these other effects, and you can turn them off and on each individually now. Like just a bevel and emboss looks kind of cool as well. So that's the big difference between opacity and fill. And you guys can use them in conjunction with each other to get different effects. So the other thing that I want to show you guys, let's just turn this invisible. That's opacity and fill when it comes to your layers. Now, we're just going to put that right there because this is not my image, by the way, but I think it's awesome and I really like it. So I decided to use it today. The other thing we're going to make that invisible, is opacity and fill when it comes to using a specific tool, like a brush tool. We're going to use a brush tool right now, and I'm going to start off with both of our opacity and our fill at 100%. And I'm just going to grab a color right here. We'll just grab something that's in the sand. So alter option, we can grab that. And let's just zoom in. So I'm using a regular soft edge brush here, and just right click and you can see the size is 52, hardness is 6%. That's not too important. But with the with the opacity and the flow at 100%, I was thinking flow and fill, that's the same. It's not the same, but I'll just show you guys what this is anyway. The opacity and flow versus the opacity and fill. Confused even me. There we go. Now, what this is the difference here, if they're both at 100% up here, basically you're just going to start painting around with exactly this color that you're chosen, and it's going to just completely cover up everything that you decide to paint on. Now, most people, when they use, they want something to be a little bit less visible, they change their opacity first. So let's try changing the opacity. Change that to about 50% or so. Now, it's the same color, but when I paint over it, you can see that it just doesn't fill as much. Like it doesn't cover as much. It's slightly opaque. Now, I'm not letting go of my paintbrush. I'm just painting over and over again the same place. And if I let go, it's all of this that I just painted is at exactly 55% opaque. If I click again and then I paint over it again, it's going to put another coat of 55% opaque on there. So this is like if you were, if you had like a clear gloss or something like that, you had to like paint an entire coat over it and then you painted another entire coat over it. But each coat basically does the exact same thing. You have to build that up. Or maybe not clear gloss, like a, very lightly colored gloss. So I'll click again and another 55%. But you can see it still hasn't completely filled everything in. Letting go and then clicking it in. Now we're starting to see it's actually filling everything we want to fill in. So that's with an opacity relatively low amount. Let's just delete that layer and get a new one. You can change your opacity pretty easily. You can just hit 0 on your keyboard. It's going to give you an opacity of 100. 5 would give you 50. 8 will give you 80. You can hit like 4 or 5 real quick and it'll give you 45. So again, same kind of thing. It's just going to not put as much down and you have to let go and then start painting again. Okay, now let's bring our opacity back up to 100 and talk about our flow. Now, flow you can get 10% to 100% by holding shift and hitting any of these numbers, just like you just hit any of the numbers. So a flow of 100%, we know what this does. It looks like that. All right, I'm gonna hit shift and 5 and we're gonna see what this does. Now, it should look about the same, but you can see it's covering more. And the reason why it covers more, if I just did that, it doesn't cover more than the other one did at around 50%. But this acts more like an airbrush. So if you go over something one time and then come back over it again, it fills itself in. And this is, you don't have to basically lift your pen or whatever tablet. If you guys are just using the mouse, that's totally cool. You don't have to like keep on making new selections over and over again. So I'll make one and then just keep going back over and over it. There we go. And it works a lot more like I would associate like a marker. Like it would just keep filling it until it gets, completely opaque. So that's what flow does. Now, typically I like to work with a relatively low flow. And the reason I do is because I can start off with something and have it be almost not visible. And then you can just kind of paint around and you can make it more visible in the places you want it to be more visible and less visible in the places you don't want it to be less visible. Or you don't want it to be visible. So let's say for this area, we want to just paint some over here and we're painting again at a flow of 6%. So I know it's not much, but you're able to get a much more natural transition usually because I'm painting over here and it is showing up, but although it's, 6%, so you're not seeing it much, but I'll just go over it in this area more and you can see it's gonna naturally fade much more because I'm just choosing to go over the areas that I want it to be a little bit darker. Not only that, but I think it's a little bit faster because you don't have to keep on lifting your pen off the paintbrush, and each time you go over something you're adding like 5 or 6% flow on there. So it allows you to build any kind of effect up really slowly. So it's not like dramatic and it's not sudden and it's not huge, but you can get something like this. It maybe looks like a dust storm back there, and I kind of chose to have the tops of these more visible and chose to put it into the sky and things like that. So going over it more and more times is what I think is good. When I first started using Photoshop, to be honest, I used flow almost never, and now I don't touch my opacity and I only use flow. So it's totally up to you. Like, it's a personal preference kind of thing. It took me years before I even really started to appreciate flow. But now that I do appreciate flow, I really, really like it. And my opacity stays at 100% all the time. I never lower my opacity, but if you guys watched Phlearn like 6 months ago, you can see I messed with my opacity all the time then. So it was one of those things where I just kind of like started it and I forced myself and I hated it for a little while. But now that I've gotten to use flow exclusively, I like it way more than I ever liked using opacity. So that officially makes me the biggest dork in the world, because now that I use flow exclusively, I love it. My whites come out whiter. But I think it's going to help you guys. So some really cool things: opacity and flow versus opacity and fill. And you guys can see definitely some cool things. So if you guys have any other ideas, like if you have any personal preferences on which one you guys use, or some cool things you guys have done with using the differences of opacity and fill or opacity and flow, let me know in the comment box below. Guys, I hope this episode helped. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope your whites come out whiter just like mine do as well. Have a great day. Have a great life. See you later. What does Snoop Dogg use to get his whites whiter? Bleach.